Hello and welcome to this edition of Consciousness Raising Online. I'm going to jump right into this because I'm not going to be long, but I want you to do me a favor if you can. I want you to put this screen on full screen for this if you don't normally do that. But if you normally do that, then cool. Because what I want you to do is I'm going to deal with a concept here, and I want you to get the full breadth of what I'm talking about. Because when I say space must be included in reparations, I'm not talking about outer space. I'm talking about human space on Earth. And what I want you to do for just a few minutes is imagine. You see, most of us don't live in huge places. Okay? Most of us, individuals and families, when we think of our housing, we basically want the same things. We want access to privacy. We want security. We want a quiet space for sleeping. And we want a design in terms of our living space that's pleasing to us. But many of us live in crowded spaces. And most of us don't really know what it's like to live in open space, big spaces, like this right here. How many of us have access to space like this? Why that's important is this. Where we live and the environment in which we live is important for our mental health, our psychological health. And what I've found, and you can check this out for yourself, talking to your friends, your neighbors, your family members, we are not used to, unless we come from wealth, we're not used to living in big spaces. Even in our homes, we'll look at that in a minute. Lighting and look at that space. Look at that space. As you look at it, you say, "Well, that's a lot of space, right?" Well, the reality is that most of us don't get to live in environments with that kind of space. Most of us live in spaces that are generally tend to be poorly designed, and they're located in neighborhoods that don't have the same amenities as wealthier neighborhoods. In fact, a lot of times we don't have much green space, and green space is that's green space right there. Okay, and we might have some access to blue space, and that's a term that you don't hear too much. But blue space is water settings, access to water. Now I live in Chicago, where we have a big old lake, Lake Michigan, but we can only deal with that on a limited basis. It's not like we can go sit out in the yard. Now, South Shore, certain shore areas, living areas close to the lake, they have access more than others. But again, blue space is necessary too. That's riverside trails and lakes, waterfront, even urban fountains. There are people that they just go sit near a fountain sometimes because that's soothing to our psyche. Okay? Now, people who live in tightly packed living spaces, it affects their well-being. Housing crowding in adults has been linked to social withdrawal, stress, high stress levels, and aggression. And I'm going to show you literally what that means in just a minute. But I want to tell you a story about my childhood that I didn't realize until not too long ago how important this was. When I was a child, my mother used to send myself and my two younger brothers down south to her hometown where her parents lived in the summertime, a little town in Kentucky. And we would go down there, and my grandparents lived in the town. But my grandfather had a brother, I guess we call him Uncle Charlie, and Uncle Charlie had a big farm. And sometimes, usually about once a week, we would get to walk down to his farm. And it must have been maybe a mile or two. I just remember we walked down the highway. It wasn't really a highway, it was just a long road. I guess it was a highway to get to his farm. And Uncle Charlie had 4 daughters, and he had this huge farm. And I remember he used to take us out sometimes on his tractor. And it seemed like you would go out to his farm area, and as far as the eye could see was his farm. Like here, you look, it was just like space. And I just remember it felt so good just to be able to go out in all that space. Even the air smelled better, felt better. And then in the evenings, because around this house, he had a huge yard, backyard. The front yard was fairly big, but it went to went from the house to the highway. But the backyard was huge. I don't know how big it was in reality, but it just seemed huge to us. And I can remember we used to be out there sometimes in the evenings catching. We didn't call them fireflies, we called them lightning bugs, and just having fun. But it was the space. And so when I lived in the city, everywhere I lived in the city, I lived in apartments. We lived in a house at one point. But here's the thing, comparatively, it was no comparison to wealthy. Now, here's what I mean. We think we live, we might live in nice places, but I want to show you the difference. Okay? And again, if you keep it on screen, that looks like a nice little living area. Little. That's their dining room right there next to the living room. Here's a living room. What looks like a nice house or a nice apartment, nice size for many of us, right? But now here, let's look at this. This is up in Harlem. And here's a nice little picture. Compare this to what we looked at a few minutes ago in terms of space. Here's a picture. Now, think of that. All those people in those crowded spaces. Here's another one. Crowded spaces. We think of them as urban, or even some people call ghetto. Now, this is a favela in Brazil. In fact, I believe it's in Rio de Janeiro. And what I want you to understand is, yes, people live in, this is tight spaces, right? But remember, there's twice as many black people in Brazil as it is in the United States. Can you imagine all that crowded space? Oops. That's a project in the United States. Think of it like this. Those are like cages. Those are like cages. You got people packed into these places. Now, here's something that should bother you, or maybe go and check it out for yourself. That's up in New York. That's a project used to be in St. Louis. Some people might recognize that. I believe it's called Pruitt-Igoe. All these projects. Here's the thing. Every one of these projects we're looking at in the United States, full of black people and brown people. You cannot find anywhere that I know of where you will find white people packed into small spaces like these. Okay? Like those projects we looked at. I don't know of a white project. Maybe there are, but I don't know of any. If you can find one, let me know. Because white people make sure that they have plenty of space. Okay? Now, it's true that in places like New York, years ago, there were these projects, some of these large apartment buildings, they might have been occupied by people we think of as white. But here's the reality. They were either Jewish, which is how we get the term ghetto, because Jewish people lived there. And when they left it, and we moved in. That's why the word ghetto, which is a European word meaning Jewish living spaces, got transferred to black people. And in other situations, you might find historically where Irish people might have lived in tight, packed in places, but that's because they weren't considered white. They were considered foreigners. Okay? But you will not find Anglo-Saxon Protestants living in cages like this. Now, the consequences of people living in spaces like this, and here's a guideline. I never heard of this until I started doing this research. Spaces that are considered to be tight, crowded spaces is when you have more family members than rooms in the house or apartment. Now, immediately you start thinking about when you were growing up, were there more family members than rooms in the house or the apartment? That's crowded. And it's been shown that children who live in crowded spaces, they find it difficult to concentrate, to sleep, to do their homework. Okay? We take it for granted. That's my point. We take it for granted, small, cramped spaces. And that's what I want to deal with today, is the idea to put it in your head that space must be included in reparations. We need to have space so we can breathe. One way to look at it is give us our mules. Give us our 40 acres, okay? Give us our 40 acres. Now, we say this and think about it, but what is 40 acres? If each of us had 40 acres, well, think of it like this. An acre is roughly the equivalent of a football field. Okay, a football field is roughly 100 yards. Okay? So think of it like that. That what if your land space was the equivalent of 40 football fields? And you could put up your house in 40 football fields and have land and lake. You could go out and sit in the backyard and look at the lake and enjoy the space. Here, that's not even 40 football fields right here. Okay? And your rooms, like this living room, to have this kind of space, high ceilings and plenty of light. Your bedroom, where your bed doesn't take up 80% of the room. You got room in the room. Here, where your children could go out and might be down the road, but you could go out and do things. Now, this is a golf course, but the idea here is space. You see, most white people make sure they have space. Look at this. Now, some people say, oh, that's too much to clean. But look at that space. If you had a large family, right? If you had a small family, okay, this is a space. That's lots of space. And space will allow you to feel better, to grow better, to breathe better, to sleep better. It helps your attitude. So as I close, I wanted to give you this concept to think about. Space must be included in reparations. We have to have our space. As always, I close with no justice, no peace, no love, KNOW. And I'll let you look at some more space for a minute or two. Because it's deep, ain't it?